The unexpected invitation. Daniel Bennett stood in his luxurious high-rise apartment, staring at the elegant invitation in his hand. The crisp ivory envelope bore a delicate gold-embossed crest, signifying a prestigious event, a wedding. More specifically, the wedding of his ex-girlfriend, Claire, to a man he had never met but had heard plenty about. The news of Claire's impending marriage had hit him harder than he ever expected. He thought he had moved on, that the heartbreak of their separation had dulled with time, but holding the invitation brought everything rushing back. A year ago, Claire had left Daniel, claiming that he was too engrossed in his work to maintain a real relationship. She'd wanted more time, more attention, and most of all, more love. Daniel had always been driven by his career, an ambition that had afforded him the kind of wealth and success most people could only dream of, but it had come at a steep cost. Claire had grown tired of feeling like she was second to his business, and after a long, tear-filled conversation, she'd walked out of his life. He hadn't realized until she was gone just how much she meant to him. Now Claire was marrying someone else, and Daniel was invited to witness it. The idea of attending the wedding alone filled him with a sense of dread. He could already picture the awkward small talk with guests, the sidelong glances from those who knew their history, and the uncomfortable silence that would inevitably fall between him and Claire when they locked eyes across the reception hall. More than anything, he feared the loneliness that would settle in his chest as he watched her say, "I do," to another man. Later that afternoon, unable to shake the disquiet the invitation had stirred in him, Daniel decided to take a walk through the city. The bustling streets of New York had always provided a strange comfort to him. The noise, the energy, the chaos. It was a welcome distraction from his internal turmoil. He strolled through the crowded sidewalks, lost in thought, until something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. On the corner of a busy intersection, sitting quietly against the cold stone of a building, was a woman. Her clothes were worn and mismatched, her hair tangled and unkempt. She sat cross-legged on the sidewalk, her back straight, her hands resting gently in her lap. Despite her appearance, there was something dignified about her, something that stood out against the harsh reality of her situation. She wasn't begging or holding a sign like so many others Daniel had passed before. Instead, she simply sat, observing the world around her with a kind, almost serene smile. Daniel stopped in his tracks, drawn to her for reasons he couldn't quite understand. His life was filled with people who wore masks of confidence, who played roles to fit into the elite circles he moved in. But this woman, sitting alone on the dirty street, radiated an authenticity that was rare in his world. Without thinking, he approached her. "Hi," Daniel said, his voice soft but warm. The woman looked up, her eyes a deep brown that seemed to hold more stories than she could ever tell. She blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting a well-dressed man to stop and talk to her. "Hello," she replied cautiously, her voice low but gentle. "My name's Daniel," he offered, suddenly feeling awkward. He had no idea what had compelled him to start a conversation with a stranger, let alone a homeless woman. But now that he was here, standing in front of her, he couldn't just walk away. "I'm Arlette," she replied, a small smile creeping onto her face. "Nice to meet you." There was a pause as Daniel shifted from foot to foot, searching for what to say next. "I don't know why, but I just felt like I should talk to you," he admitted, feeling silly the moment the words left his mouth. What was he doing? This wasn't him. He didn't strike up random conversations with strangers on the street. He barely had time for the people in his life, let alone for spontaneous acts of kindness. But Arlette's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew softer, more understanding. "People don't usually stop to talk to me," she said, her tone light but not bitter. "So, thank you." Daniel felt a wave of shame wash over him. Here he was, someone who lived in a world of excess, someone who could fix most problems with a swipe of his credit card, and yet he had spent so much of his life ignoring people like Arlette. People who had stories and struggles, who had lives beyond their circumstances. "You look like you've had a rough time," Daniel said, immediately regretting how blunt he sounded. He winced internally, hoping she wouldn't take offense. Arlette, to his relief, chuckled lightly. "You could say that," she replied. "Life hasn't exactly been kind lately, but I'm still here." There was something in the way she said it, so matter-of-fact, so unflinchingly resilient, that struck Daniel deeply. He had faced his own struggles, sure, but nothing compared to what Arlette had likely endured. And yet, here she was, sitting on a cold city street, smiling as if the world hadn't beaten her down. They talked for a few more minutes, Daniel asking about her story, and Arlette sharing bits and pieces. She had once lived a normal life, she explained, but had fallen on hard times after losing her job and facing a series of unfortunate events. Without a support system, she had slowly slipped through the cracks, eventually finding herself on the streets. But through it all, she had held on to her hope and her kindness. The more Daniel listened, the more he admired her strength. Here was someone who had every reason to give up, yet she hadn't. He thought about the wedding invitation in his pocket and the pit of anxiety that had formed in his stomach. Compared to what Arlette had gone through, his problems seemed trivial. And then, in a moment of impulsive compassion, perhaps mixed with a desire to disrupt the monotony of his own life, Daniel asked a question that would change everything. "Would you like to come to a wedding with me?" Arlette's eyes widened in surprise, her expression one of pure confusion. "A wedding?" "Yeah," Daniel said, feeling a little ridiculous as he said it out loud. "It's my ex-girlfriend's wedding, actually. I could use some company." Arlette stared at him, clearly unsure if he was serious. "You want me to go to your ex's wedding?" Daniel nodded, trying to sound casual about what was clearly a bizarre offer. "Why not? You deserve a day to feel special. I'll make sure you have a nice dress, a good meal, and a chance to experience something different. What do you say?" For a long moment, Arlette said nothing. She seemed to be weighing the absurdity of the situation, and Daniel couldn't blame her. This wasn't something normal people did. But then, slowly, her lips curved into a small smile. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'll go with you." Neither of them knew it at the time, but that simple decision would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. Transformation begins. The following morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, sipping on his coffee and staring out of the wide window that offered a breathtaking view of the New York skyline. His thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation he had with Arlette. The idea of taking a homeless woman to a high-society wedding still struck him as impulsive and out of character, yet the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. He had never been one for spontaneous decisions, but this was different. This felt necessary, as if some unseen force had nudged him to do it. He knew this wasn't just about having someone accompany him to Claire's wedding. It was about more than his discomfort or anxiety at seeing his ex-girlfriend marry someone else. Deep down, Daniel felt like he had to do something meaningful, not just for himself, but for Arlette. He could sense that she hadn't been shown much kindness in a long time, and the opportunity to give her a day where she felt like she mattered was something he couldn't pass up. By noon, Daniel had made all the arrangements. He called his assistant, who had already secured a reservation at one of the city's most exclusive boutiques. They were known for dressing celebrities and socialites for red carpet events, and Daniel was confident that Arlette would leave the shop feeling like a new person. After all, what was the point of having money and resources if you couldn't use them to help someone who truly needed it? Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself back on the same street corner where he had met Arlette. She was sitting in the same spot, her back against the wall, watching the pedestrians pass her by. When she saw him approach, her face lit up with a smile, one that seemed more genuine than anything he had seen in a long time. "You came back," she said, as if still unsure if their conversation had actually happened the day before. "I said I would," Daniel replied, offering her a hand. "Come on, we've got somewhere to be." Arlette hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her worn clothes and dirt-smudged hands. "I don't think I'm ready to be seen in a place you're taking me," she said with a nervous laugh. "I mean, look at me." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her this time. Her clothes were faded and tattered, her hair tangled and dull, but none of that mattered to him. He saw something else, an untapped resilience, a quiet dignity, and a strength that had survived despite everything life had thrown at her. Arlette's outer appearance might have been rough around the edges, but there was an undeniable beauty in the way she carried herself, a beauty that most people overlooked. "You're perfect just the way you are," Daniel said softly. "But today, I want to give you something special. Come on, let's go." With a bit of reluctance, Arlette took his hand and stood. They made their way through the bustling streets, a stark contrast in appearance. Daniel in his tailored designer suit, and Arlette in her ragged clothes. But for some reason, no one seemed to notice. Maybe it was the way Daniel held his head high, or maybe it was the invisible bond that had already begun to form between them. Either way, they walked together, side by side, as if they belonged in this world, even if it seemed improbable to everyone else. When they arrived at the boutique, Arlette's eyes widened in disbelief. The large glass windows displayed mannequins dressed in stunning gowns, shimmering under the soft glow of elegant lighting. It was a place of opulence, the kind of shop that catered to the rich and famous, far removed from the world Arlette had been living in. "I don't think I belong here," she whispered, her voice tinged with both awe and fear. Daniel turned to her, his eyes soft but serious. "You belong anywhere you want to be, Arlette. Don't ever think otherwise." Inside, the boutique was a vision of luxury. The interior was sleek and modern, with gold accents and plush velvet seating areas. High-fashion dresses, sparkling jewelry, and designer shoes lined the walls, each piece a work of art. As soon as they stepped through the doors, a saleswoman approached them, her eyes sweeping over Arlette with a momentary flicker of judgment before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Good afternoon, sir. How can we assist you today?" the woman asked, her voice smooth but distant. Daniel smiled politely. "We're here to find something for my friend," he said, gesturing to Arlette. "She needs a dress for a very special occasion." The saleswoman raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the situation. Arlette, feeling the weight of the judgment, shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting together in front of her. Sensing her discomfort, Daniel stepped forward, his tone firm but calm. "I'm sure you have something that will make her feel extraordinary. Let's see your best." It wasn't a request. Daniel's tone carried the weight of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, and the saleswoman immediately straightened, her expression becoming more attentive. "Of course," she said quickly. "Right this way." For the next hour, Daniel watched as Arlette was transformed before his eyes. The boutique staff, now fully committed to their task, brought out dress after dress, each more beautiful than the last. Arlette, initially hesitant, slowly began to relax as they helped her try on different gowns, their expert hands styling her hair and applying light makeup. Daniel could see the uncertainty in her eyes begin to fade, replaced by something else. Confidence, perhaps, or maybe hope. Finally, after what seemed like dozens of dresses, they found the one. It was a deep emerald green gown, simple yet elegant, with a soft, flowing fabric that draped perfectly over Arlette's figure. When she stepped out of the fitting room, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She looked stunning. More than stunning, really. She looked like someone who had reclaimed a part of herself that had been lost long ago. Arlette turned to face the mirror, and for a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. She ran her fingers over the fabric, marveling at the way it felt against her skin. It had been years since she had worn anything this beautiful, years since she had felt anything other than invisible. "Wow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is that really me?" Daniel, standing a few feet behind her, nodded, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "That's you," he said quietly. the real you. Arlette's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them away before they could fall. She had been strong for so long, had held herself together even when the world had been cruel and unkind. But standing here, in this dress, in this boutique that seemed worlds away from the streets she had called home, she felt a part of herself she thought was gone forever. For the first time in a long time, she felt beautiful. "I don't know how to thank you," Arlette said, turning to face Daniel, her eyes brimming with gratitude. I've never had anything like this." Daniel shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. This is your moment, Arlette. You deserve to feel special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." They left the boutique together, Arlette carrying her new dress carefully in a garment bag. As they walked through the city streets, Daniel felt lighter than he had in months. There was something about being with Arlette that made him forget about the pressures of his career, the loneliness that had been gnawing at him since Claire left. In her presence, everything seemed simpler, more meaningful. That evening, as they sat together in a small, cozy cafe, Arlette opened up about her past. She talked about the job she had lost, the friends who had drifted away, the series of events that had led her to the streets. It wasn't a sob story, nor did she seek pity. She spoke with quiet strength, her voice steady as she recounted the hardships she had faced. Daniel listened, truly listened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt connected to someone on a deeper level. It wasn't about appearances or status or wealth. It was about shared humanity, about the understanding that came from facing your own demons and surviving. They talked for hours, and by the end of the night, they both felt something had shifted. Their bond, once formed from a simple act of kindness, had grown into something more profound. They were no longer strangers, no longer two people from vastly different worlds. They were, in that moment, equals. As Daniel walked Arlette back to his apartment, where she would stay for the night before the wedding, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. He had no idea what the wedding would bring, whether it would be awkward or painful, but he knew one thing for certain. Arlette had already changed his life, and he had a feeling that this was only the beginning. The wedding day. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, with the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of a new beginning. The world outside seemed calm, but inside Daniel's spacious apartment, there was a quiet sense of anticipation, and for both him and Arlette, a touch of nervousness. As the early morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Daniel paced the living room, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the glass, while he waited for Arlette to finish getting ready. He had done everything he could to ensure she would feel comfortable today. He had hired a professional hairstylist and makeup artist to come to his apartment, transforming the place into a makeshift beauty salon. He wanted her to feel not just beautiful, but confident, like she belonged among the high society guests who would surely be attending. Yet despite all his efforts, Daniel still couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than appearances. Something deeper was at stake, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As the clock inched closer to noon, Daniel found himself lost in thought. The wedding, Claire's wedding, was supposed to be the focus of the day. But over the last few days, Claire had occupied his thoughts less and less. Instead, it was Arlette who had come to the forefront of his mind. She had entered his life so unexpectedly, yet she now seemed to be a part of it in a way he hadn't anticipated. The connection they had formed was undeniable, and it both intrigued and confused him. Just as Daniel was about to check the time for the third time in 10 minutes, the soft click of a door opening echoed through the apartment. He turned, and for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. Arlette stepped out of the guest bedroom, dressed in the emerald green gown they had chosen the day before. The fabric flowed effortlessly over her figure, hugging her curves in all the right places while draping elegantly at her feet. Her hair, once tangled and unkempt, was now styled in soft waves that framed her face. The makeup was subtle yet effective, enhancing her natural beauty without overwhelming it. She looked like a different person. And yet, to Daniel, she was still the same woman he had met on the street corner. The same woman with the quiet dignity and strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. "Wow," Daniel murmured, unable to hide the admiration in his voice. "You look stunning." Arlette blushed, glancing down at herself as if she couldn't quite believe what she saw. "It's all a bit overwhelming," she admitted with a shy smile. "I've never worn anything like this before." Daniel walked toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You wear it well," he said softly. "And you deserve to feel as incredible as you look." Arlette's smile grew, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I hope I don't embarrass you," she said, her voice laced with nervous laughter. "I mean, this is your ex-girlfriend's wedding. I don't exactly fit in with these kinds of people." Daniel shook his head, his gaze gentle but firm. "You're not going to embarrass me. In fact, I think you're going to be the most impressive person there." Arlette looked at him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, but she found none. Daniel meant every word. She had faced more hardships than anyone at that wedding could ever understand, and yet she stood here with grace, courage, and kindness. To him, that was more impressive than all the wealth and status in the world. "Thank you, Daniel," she said quietly. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done for me." "You don't have to repay me," Daniel replied with a soft smile. "Just be yourself. That's more than enough." They left the apartment together, stepping out into the crisp autumn day, and hailed a cab to take them to the wedding venue. As they rode through the busy streets, Daniel found himself glancing at Arlette every so often, marveling at the way she carried herself. She was still nervous. He could tell by the way she fiddled with the fabric of her dress. But there was a quiet determination in her eyes, a resolve that made Daniel feel oddly proud. The venue itself was nothing short of grand. Set in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, the event was the epitome of high society elegance. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, and the grand entrance was adorned with towering floral arrangements and gleaming chandeliers. As the cab pulled up to the entrance, Daniel could feel Arlette tense beside him. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city beyond. Daniel reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You can, and I'll be right beside you the whole time." They stepped out of the cab together, and from the moment they set foot on the estate grounds, Daniel could feel the eyes of the other guests on them. He knew what they were thinking. He could almost hear their whispered judgments. Who was the woman on his arm? She certainly wasn't someone they recognized, and for someone like Daniel, who had always been careful about appearances, this was an unusual choice. But Daniel didn't care. Let them stare, let them whisper. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, not for his image, not for his reputation, but because it was the right thing to do. As they made their way through the grand entrance hall, the murmurs grew louder. Heads turned, eyes followed them, and Daniel could sense the curiosity and speculation hanging in the air like a thick fog. But Arlette, to her credit, held her head high. She walked beside him with the same quiet grace she had shown on the streets, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of awe and determination. She didn't shrink under the weight of their stares. If anything, she seemed to grow taller. At last, they entered the ballroom where the ceremony would take place. The space was breathtakingly beautiful, with high ceilings draped in cascading white flowers and rows of plush seating arranged in perfect symmetry. The soft hum of a string quartet played in the background, adding to the ethereal atmosphere. Everything about the event screamed luxury and refinement, and yet, for all its beauty, Daniel felt strangely out of place. And then he saw her, Claire. She stood near the front of the room, talking to a group of guests, her back turned to him. Even from a distance, Daniel could recognize her unmistakable silhouette. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant updo, and the dress she wore, a soft ivory gown with intricate lace detailing, made her look every bit the part of a bride. For a moment, Daniel's heart clenched in his chest. Seeing her like this, so close yet so far from the life they had once shared, brought back a flood of memories. Memories of late-night talks, stolen kisses, and quiet moments when he had believed they would spend the rest of their lives together. But those days were gone now, and as Claire turned and caught sight of him, her eyes widening in surprise, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Yes, there was still a part of him that mourned what they had lost, but as he stood there with Arlette by his side, he realized that he was no longer the same man who had loved Claire all those years ago. He had changed, and maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. Claire's eyes flickered to Arlette, and for a brief moment, Daniel could see the confusion on her face. She had expected him to come alone, perhaps to brood silently in the background while she celebrated her new life. But Daniel had defied her expectations, and now, standing before her with Arlette on his arm, he felt more in control of his emotions than he had in a long time. "Daniel," Claire said as she approached, her voice soft and tentative. "I'm surprised to see you here." Daniel smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wasn't sure if I'd come, but I'm glad I did." Claire's gaze shifted to Arlette, and though she tried to hide it, Daniel could sense the judgment behind her polite smile. "And this is Arlette," Daniel said, his voice steady. "She's my guest." Arlette met Claire's gaze with a calm smile, offering a quiet, "Nice to meet you." Claire's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, offering a thin smile in return. "Well, I hope you both enjoy the wedding. It's going to be a beautiful day." With that, Claire turned and walked away, leaving Daniel and Arlette standing alone in the crowded room. For a moment, Daniel felt the weight of the encounter, the finality of it. This was the end of a chapter in his life, one he had clung to for far too long. But as he looked at Arlette, standing tall and graceful beside him, he realized that maybe it wasn't just an ending. It was also the beginning of something new. "Are you okay?" Arlette asked quietly, her eyes filled with concern. Daniel nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I am." They found their seats as the ceremony began, and as the music swelled and the bride walked down the aisle, Daniel felt a sense of closure wash over him. Claire was moving on, and so was he. But what he hadn't anticipated was the sense of freedom that came with it, a freedom that allowed him to truly appreciate the woman sitting beside him, the woman who had shown him that life was about more than appearances and status. As the ceremony continued, Daniel glanced over at Arlette, and in that moment, he knew that this was just the start of their journey together. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The ripple effect. The wedding ceremony moved forward with all the elegance one might expect from such a high society event. The vows were exchanged under an arch of cascading white flowers, the soft music from the quartet filling the grand hall. Daniel sat beside Arlette, his mind drifting in and out of the present. His eyes flickered between the couple at the altar and the woman sitting next to him. And with each passing moment, he felt a subtle but powerful shift in his heart. For so long, he had imagined this moment, the moment where Claire would marry someone else, and had assumed it would be unbearable. He had braced himself for the tidal wave of regret, the crushing realization that she was truly gone from his life. But now, as Claire and her new husband kissed to the applause of the crowd, Daniel felt only a gentle closure. The ache of their past had dulled to a quiet hum in the background, overtaken by the presence of something more profound, a growing connection with Arlette, a woman who had entered his life by chance, but had already left an indelible mark on it. When the ceremony ended, and the guests began to file out of the hall and into the reception area, Daniel and Arlette stayed seated for a moment longer, absorbing the atmosphere. "How are you feeling?" Arlette asked softly, her voice cutting through the buzz of conversation around them. There was genuine concern in her eyes, a depth of empathy that Daniel hadn't experienced in a long time. He considered her question, then smiled, though it was a bit wistful. Surprisingly, at peace, he admitted. I thought it would hurt more, seeing her like this. But now that I'm here, I realize it's not about her anymore. It's about me. And where I want to go from here. Arlette nodded, her gaze steady. Sometimes, letting go isn't as painful as holding on. Maybe it's a sign that you're ready for something new. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head slightly. You're wise beyond your years, you know that. Arlette shrugged, a smile tugging at her lips. Life has a way of teaching you things, whether you want to learn them or not. The two of them shared a quiet moment, a small bubble of stillness in the otherwise bustling room. Then, with a deep breath, Daniel stood and offered his hand to her. Come on, he said. Let's see what the reception has in store for us. The reception was held in a vast ballroom that was every bit as extravagant as the ceremony itself. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Tables were set with fine china and sparkling glassware, each place adorned with delicate floral arrangements. Waitstaff in tuxedos moved seamlessly through the crowd, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres to the well-dressed guests. It was a scene straight out of a luxury magazine, a picture of wealth and sophistication that Daniel had grown accustomed to. But to Arlette, it was like stepping into another world. As they entered the room, Daniel could feel the eyes of the other guests on them again, though this time the whispers seemed louder, more pointed. People were curious about Arlette, about who she was, where she came from, and why she was here with Daniel. It was clear that many of them assumed she didn't belong, their glances betraying their unspoken judgments. Daniel's jaw tightened, but when he looked over at Arlette, she was handling it with remarkable composure. She held her head high, her shoulders back, and her gaze steady as she walked beside him. There was no sign of the uncertainty she had shown earlier. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, as if daring anyone to underestimate her. Daniel couldn't help but admire her strength. It was one thing to put on a beautiful dress and wear makeup. It was another entirely to walk into a room full of strangers and stand tall in the face of their scrutiny. They found their assigned seats at one of the larger tables near the center of the room. As they sat down, Daniel caught sight of a few familiar faces, old acquaintances from his business world, people he hadn't seen in months. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and an expensive-looking suit, approached the table with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Daniel Bennett, the man said, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of condescension. It's been a while. Didn't expect to see you here. And who is this lovely lady? Daniel stiffened slightly, recognizing the tone all too well. This was Mitchell Hayward, an old business rival who had always taken pleasure in subtle jabs and backhanded compliments. Daniel knew exactly what Mitchell was implying, that Arlette didn't fit the image of the typical women who accompanied men like him to such events. But Daniel refused to let the comment get to him. This is Arlette, Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. She's my guest. Mitchell's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. Pleasure to meet you, Arlette, he said, his tone dripping with insincerity. You certainly stand out tonight. Arlette met his gaze without flinching. Thank you, she said simply. I suppose that's better than blending in. There was a beat of silence, and Daniel couldn't help but smile at the way Arlette had so effortlessly turned the comment back on Mitchell. The man's smirk faltered, clearly not expecting such a poised response, and after a moment of awkwardness, he excused himself and moved on to another group of guests. Daniel leaned closer to Arlette, his voice low. You handled that perfectly. Arlette shrugged, her expression unreadable. You learn how to deal with people like him when you've spent enough time being invisible, she said quietly. They expect you to shrink away, but I've done enough shrinking in my life. Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. He could only admire the resilience that radiated from her. For someone who had been through so much, Arlette had an inner strength that he found himself drawn to more and more with each passing moment. As the evening wore on, They mingled with the other guests, though Daniel made sure to stay close to Arlette, sensing that the stares and whispers were becoming harder for her to ignore. But despite the judgmental glances, Arlette never faltered. She conversed politely with anyone who approached, her smile never wavering, though Daniel could tell there was a part of her that was growing weary. Eventually, the time came for dinner, and they took their seats at the elegantly decorated table. The conversations around them buzzed with the usual small talk, business deals, vacations, and gossip about other guests. Daniel had always found these events tedious, a display of wealth and status disguised as celebration, but tonight felt different. With Arlette beside him, everything seemed more bearable, more grounded. As the meal progressed, Daniel noticed that some of the guests were starting to warm up to Arlette. Perhaps it was her quiet charm, or maybe it was the fact that she carried herself with such grace despite the initial scrutiny. Whatever the reason, a few people began engaging her in conversation, and Daniel watched with quiet admiration as she navigated the discussions with ease. She didn't try to pretend to be something she wasn't. Instead, she spoke honestly about her life, her experiences, and her perspective on the world. At one point, an older woman sitting across from them, elegantly dressed in pearls and a designer gown, leaned in and asked Arlette, "So, what do you do, dear? I don't believe I've seen you at events like this before." Arlette hesitated for a split second, then smiled softly. "I don't really attend events like this often," she admitted. "My life's been a bit different from most people here." The woman raised an eyebrow, but seemed genuinely curious. Different how? Arlette glanced at Daniel, as if seeking permission, and when he gave her an encouraging nod, she took a deep breath. "I've been homeless for the past few years," she said quietly but confidently. "I've faced a lot of challenges, but I've learned a lot about resilience and kindness along the way." There was a brief moment of silence at the table, and Daniel could feel the tension. He braced himself for what might come next, expecting judgment or awkwardness, but to his surprise, the older woman simply smiled. "Well, you've certainly done a remarkable job of rising above those challenges," she said kindly. "I imagine you've learned more about life than most of us could ever hope to." Arlette's smile softened, and for the first time that evening, Daniel saw her relax completely. It was a small victory, but an important one. As the evening wound down, the guests began to move toward the dance floor, where the band had started playing soft, melodic tunes. Daniel and Arlette stayed at the table for a while, watching as couples glided across the polished floor, their laughter and chatter filling the room. Daniel could feel the weight of the day beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of contentment. "Do you want to dance?" Daniel asked suddenly, surprising even himself with the question. Arlette blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I don't know how to dance like them," she admitted, glancing at the elegant couples twirling gracefully around the room. Daniel stood, offering his hand with a playful smile. "Then let's not dance like them," he said. "Let's just dance." Arlette hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Together, they walked to the center of the dance floor, and as the music swirled around them, Daniel pulled her into a slow, easy rhythm. They weren't following any particular steps or trying to impress anyone. They simply moved together, in their own world, as if no one else existed. For the first time that night, Daniel felt truly free, freed from the expectations of the past, from the judgments of others, and from the weight of his own insecurities. And as he danced with Arlette, he realized that this was more than just a moment. It was the start of something new, something he hadn't even known he was searching for. As they swayed gently to the music, Arlette looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music, "for everything." Daniel smiled, his heart light. "I should be the one thanking you." They continued to dance, the world fading away around them, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. A world transformed. The night of the wedding had passed in a surreal blur, And as the evening came to a close, Daniel found himself walking alongside Arlette, their footsteps quiet against the cobblestone path leading away from the grand reception. The opulent lights of the estate behind them seemed distant now, as if they were already leaving behind not just a wedding, but a chapter of their lives that was now closed. Daniel felt the cool autumn air brush his skin as they made their way back to the car, their breaths visible in the night air. Neither of them spoke much during the drive back to the city. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but rather one filled with mutual reflection. Daniel found his thoughts drifting to everything that had unfolded that day. Flair, the wedding, the curious glances from strangers. But most of all, he found himself thinking about Arlette. There was something about her presence that felt grounding, like she had become an anchor in a storm he hadn't even realized he was caught in. By the time they reached Daniel's apartment, it was well past midnight. The city was quiet in a way that only New York could be, humming with the residual energy of the day, but softened by the late hour. Daniel escorted Arlette up to the apartment, and as they stepped inside, the warm glow of the interior lights felt like a stark contrast to the grandiosity of the wedding they had just left behind. Arlette walked in first, slipping off her heels with a sigh of relief. "I never knew shoes could hurt this much," she muttered, glancing down at the glittering heels that had, by all appearances, completed her transformation into someone who looked as though they belonged in high society. Daniel chuckled softly. "Welcome to the world of formal events. It's all about appearances, even if it costs you a few blisters." Arlette laughed, her voice soft and genuine, but it faded quickly as she sat down on the plush couch in the living room. Her fingers traced the fabric absent-mindedly, her eyes distant, as though she were still processing everything that had happened. After a few moments of silence, she looked up at Daniel, her expression unreadable. "I don't think I've ever felt so out of place," she admitted quietly. "I mean, everyone was kind to me. Well, most of them were, but I still felt like an outsider, like I didn't belong there." Daniel sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He had expected this conversation, had sensed it simmering under the surface all night. "You held your own, though," he said softly. "No one would have guessed that you weren't used to events like that. You carried yourself with more grace than most people in that room." Arlette smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I appreciate that, but it's not just about appearances. You can wear the most beautiful dress, put on makeup, and smile for the cameras, but it doesn't change what's inside. I felt like I was wearing a mask the whole time, pretending to be someone I'm not." Daniel frowned, sensing the deeper truth behind her words. "You don't have to pretend with me, Arlette. I didn't bring you there to turn you into someone else. I brought you because I wanted you there. You're not just a guest. You're someone who matters to me." Arlette's eyes softened at his words, but she still looked away, as though she couldn't fully accept them. "It's hard to believe that sometimes," she admitted. "For so long, I've been invisible. Living on the streets, you become part of the background. People pass you by without a second glance, like you're not even human. It does something to you, Daniel. It changes the way you see yourself." Daniel felt a tightening in his chest at her words, a deep sadness for what she had endured. He had always known that life on the streets was brutal, but hearing it from someone he cared about, someone who had lived it, made it all the more real. "Arlette," he said quietly, "you're not invisible anymore. Not to me, and not to anyone else who takes the time to really see you." She looked up at him then, her eyes shining with unused tears. For a moment, she didn't speak, as though she was gathering the strength to let her guard down completely. And when she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been on my own for so long," she said. "I'm used to taking care of myself, to not needing anyone. But tonight made me realize something. No matter how strong I think I am, there's still a part of me that's scared. Scared that this," she gestured around the room, "this kindness, this life, it's temporary. That I don't really belong in it." Daniel's heart ached at her words. He moved closer, sitting beside her on the couch. "You do belong," he said firmly. "You belong in any life you want. And if you feel out of place right now, that's because the world has done a terrible job of making room for people like you. People who've been through hell, but still managed to come out the other side with their kindness intact." Arlette's lip trembled, and she looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this," she said softly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads, and I don't know which way to go." Daniel felt the weight of her words. He knew that this wasn't just about the wedding or the awkwardness she had felt at the event. This was about something much bigger. Her entire life was on the verge of change, and it terrified her. "You don't have to decide right now," Daniel said gently. "Whatever happens next, you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and I'll support you, no matter what path you choose." Arlette looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Daniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat like that for what felt like hours, the silence between them comforting rather than heavy. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," Arlette whispered. "To deserve you." Daniel shook his head, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "You don't have to deserve kindness, Arlette. Everyone deserves it." Over the next few days, Daniel noticed subtle but significant changes in Arlette. She had stayed at his apartment, at first unsure of whether she wanted to leave. The city streets, once her home, now seemed like a distant memory, but the fear of going back still lingered in her mind. Each morning, she would sit by the large windows, staring out at the bustling city below, as if trying to make sense of it all. Daniel gave her space, knowing that she was processing more than just the events of the wedding. He didn't push her to make any decisions, but he made sure she knew that whatever choice she made, he would support her. And in those quiet moments when they sat together, Daniel found himself reflecting on his own life as well. The wedding had been a turning point for both of them, but for Daniel, it had been more than just closure with Claire. It had been a wake-up call, a realization that the life he had been chasing for so long, the success and wealth he had prioritized, wasn't the life he truly wanted. He had spent so many years building his empire, focusing on work and pushing away anyone who threatened to slow him down. But now, with Arlette in his life, he could see the emptiness in all of it. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Daniel finally voiced what had been weighing on his mind. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "about what comes next." Arlette looked over at him, her eyes curious. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "For the longest time, I thought I knew what I wanted. Success, power, recognition, all of it seemed so important. But now, I don't know. It doesn't seem like enough anymore." Arlette didn't say anything, but her gaze was soft and understanding, encouraging him to continue. "I've spent so much of my life trying to prove myself to people who don't really matter," Daniel continued, his voice growing more certain as he spoke. "I've neglected the things that actually make life worth living. Real connections, meaningful experiences. I've been so focused on climbing the ladder that I didn't realize how lonely it was at the top." Arlette's eyes widened slightly, as though she hadn't expected him to open up like this. "You've achieved so much, Daniel," she said quietly, "but I understand what you mean. Sometimes, the things we chase aren't the things that will truly make us happy." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of her words sink in. "I want something different," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I want to build a life that actually means something. One that's not just about money or success, but about people, about giving back." Arlette smiled then, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "You're already doing that," she said softly. "You're changing lives, starting with mine." Daniel felt his heart swell at her words. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then maybe we can figure this out together," he said. Maybe we can both find a way forward, one that feels right." Arlette's eyes shimmered with emotion, and she nodded. "I'd like that." They sat together, hand in hand, as the city lights flickered below them. And for the first time in a long time, both Daniel and Arlette felt a sense of hope, not just for themselves, but for the future they could create together. A new beginning. In the weeks following the wedding, life settled into a quieter rhythm for Daniel and Arlette, yet nothing felt the same as it had before. The events of that day had planted seeds of change, and both of them felt the weight of decisions still to be made. Arlette remained in Daniel's apartment, hesitant to move back to the streets she had once called home, but equally unsure of her place in his world of wealth and privilege. She found herself at a crossroads, just as Daniel had, unsure of which path to choose, but increasingly certain that the life she had known before was no longer an option. For Daniel, those weeks were a time of deep reflection. The intense focus on his work, the drive for success that had once consumed him, now seemed less important than the relationships he had neglected and the empty spaces in his life that money could never fill. Claire's wedding had been a closure he didn't know he needed, but Arlette had become the unexpected opening to a new chapter, one that was both challenging and full of possibilities. One rainy afternoon, Daniel sat in his office, his gaze distant as he stared out the window at the gray cityscape. His desk, normally cluttered with contracts and business proposals, sat untouched. A proposal for a major new venture lay open in front of him, but his mind wasn't on the deal. Instead, he found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Arlette on his balcony, about wanting something more meaningful from life. He had been considering stepping back from his work, at least for a while, to figure out what truly mattered. But every time he thought about walking away, a voice in his head warned him of the risks, the fear of losing everything he had built, of stepping into the unknown without a clear plan. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of his office door opening. Arlette stepped in, looking more comfortable in the space than she had when she first moved in, but still with a quiet hesitance, as if she wasn't entirely sure she belonged. She wore a simple, modest dress, something she had picked out herself after they'd gone shopping together a few days ago. It was understated, but it suited her. Arlette had begun to shed the worn clothes of her past, yet she remained grounded, refusing to let the luxury around her define who she was. "Am I interrupting?" she asked softly, glancing at the untouched papers on his desk. Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "No, not at all. I could use the distraction." Arlette walked over to the window, standing next to him, as she looked out at the rain-soaked city. The atmosphere between them was easy, comfortable in its silence. After a few moments, Arlette spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been thinking," she began, her gaze still fixed on the window, "about what you said, about wanting something different, something more meaningful." Daniel turned his attention to her, sensing that this was something important. "What have you decided?" he asked gently. Arlette hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the windowsill. "I don't want to go back to the streets," she said finally. "I can't. But I also don't want to just stay here, living in a bubble, cut off from the world I came from. I've been given this incredible chance, thanks to you, and I don't want to waste it." Daniel remained silent, letting her continue. "I want to help people," Arlette said, her voice gaining strength. "I've been thinking about the other people I've met on the streets, the ones who are still out there, struggling every day just to survive. They don't have the opportunities I've been given. And I can't just sit here, in this beautiful apartment, knowing that so many others are still suffering." Daniel felt a surge of admiration for her. This was exactly why he had been drawn to Arlette in the first place, her unwavering compassion, her refusal to forget where she came from. Even when offered a way out, she wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about others, about the people society had overlooked and left behind. "What do you want to do?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "I want to start something," Arlette said, her eyes shining with determination. A program, maybe. Something that can provide shelter, resources, and, more importantly, hope to people who are homeless or on the verge of it. I don't have the experience to run something like that, but I'd lived it. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to be treated like you're nothing. And I want to change that. Daniel's heart swelled with pride as he listened to her. He could see the fire in her eyes, the passion that drove her to make a difference. And in that moment, he realized that this was exactly what he had been searching for as well, a purpose that went beyond wealth and success, something that could truly change lives. "You don't have to do it alone," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I can help you. We can build this together." Arlette turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You'd want to help? I mean, this is a huge thing I'm talking about. I don't even know where to start." Daniel smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "You start by taking the first step," he said gently. "And you don't have to know everything right away. I've got resources, connections, and a lot of experience in building things. But this will be different. It won't be about profit or success. It'll be about people. And that's exactly what I want to be a part of." Arlette looked down at their joined hands, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I don't know how I got so lucky to meet you, Daniel," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "It's not about luck. We both needed something real, and I think we found it in each other." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and discussions as Arlette and Daniel began to lay the foundation for their project. Arlette had a vision. She wanted to create a safe haven, a place where people who had fallen on hard times could come for more than just a bed and a meal. She envisioned a community center where people could access mental health services, job training, and long-term support to help them rebuild their lives. Daniel used his connections to set up meetings with nonprofit experts and community leaders. They consulted with organizations that were already working in the field, learning about the challenges and opportunities that came with tackling homelessness. Arlette threw herself into the work with a passion that inspired everyone around her. She attended every meeting, asked thoughtful questions, and took detailed notes. The transformation from the woman Daniel had first met on the street corner to the driven, determined advocate standing before him was nothing short of remarkable. But the work wasn't easy. They encountered obstacles at every turn: funding issues, bureaucratic red tape, and skepticism from people who doubted their ability to make a difference. Arlette, in particular, faced her share of doubts. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead, when she wondered if she was really capable of leading such an ambitious project. One evening, after a particularly frustrating meeting with potential donors who had questioned her qualifications, Arlette returned to the apartment in tears. She sat on the couch, her shoulders slumped, as Daniel brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every time I try to explain my vision, people look at me like I'm just some charity case who doesn't know what she's talking about. They don't take me seriously." Daniel placed a comforting hand on her back, his voice gentle but firm. "You can do this, Arlette. And you know more about this issue than anyone else in the room. You've lived it. You've experienced it firsthand. That's more valuable than any degree or title they can throw at you." Arlette sniffled, wiping away her tears. "But what if it's not enough? What if I fail?" "You won't fail," Daniel said, his voice filled with conviction. "Because you're not in this alone. You have me, and we'll figure this out together. We'll prove them wrong." Arlette looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Daniel." "You won't have to find out," he replied with a soft smile. Months passed, and slowly but surely, their dream began to take shape. They secured the funding they needed, found a location for their community center, and began hiring a dedicated team of social workers, counselors, and volunteers. The day the center finally opened its doors, Arlette stood outside, looking up at the building with a mix of awe and disbelief. "I can't believe we did it," she whispered. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. You did it, he corrected gently. This was your vision. I just helped along the way. Arlette turned to him, her eyes shimmering with emotion. I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Daniel smiled, pulling her into a hug. You never needed anyone's permission to be great, Arlette. You always had it in you. As they stood there, watching the first group of people walk through the doors of the center, Daniel felt a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced in all his years of chasing success. This, helping people, making a real difference, was what life was about. And as he held Arlette close, he realized that his future was no longer about business deals or status. It was about love, compassion, and building a world where people like Arlette could not only survive, but thrive. Together, they had found something more than wealth or status. They had found purpose, and in that purpose, they had found each other.